Hello, and welcome to God in Film, the podcast where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any parallels with the gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm writer and unexpected father figure, Giles Goff.
And I'm librarian and lone bounty hunter, Julia Hall.
And today, continuing with Season 7 of this lockdown project that got out of hand, we'll be looking at adoption in the family of God, how to support someone leaving a fundamentalist religion, and what happens when your religion tries to make you choose between it and your kid. Now, Julia, I get the impression that this show might be a little bit special to you.
I just want to make it known, officially on the record, that I would die for Grogu. I would do anything for that adorable green bundle of joy. I would give him all my possessions and everything I owned because I love him on a fundamental level.
Mm-hmm.
He's perfect, and who I assume it was Jon Favreau that kind of came up with him, but whichever writer or puppetry design person who came up with this, you're welcome. The success, because the amount of Baby Yoda Grogu stuff there is being sold now, you are reaping your just rewards because he is incredible. The show's pretty good too.
Yeah. There's a marked demarcation in the way I react to Star Trek, as I think you know, and how I react to Star Wars. Star Wars, I feel like I'm a guest in somebody else's universe there, you know?
I feel we're two sides of the coin.
Two sides of the same coin here, exactly, you know?
The great thing with Star Wars is that there's so many facets to it. For some people, I have some semi-strong opinions about this. For some people, Star Wars is all about the Jedi and the Sith and the Battle of the Force and these flouncy space wizards with their robes.
Mm-hmm.
The real G's know that Star Wars is about the people on the ground, like people like the Mandalorian. If you've watched Rogue One, those kinds of stories, which are really war stories, more sci-fi kind of epics. But I feel there's some facet of Star Wars that will appeal to everybody.
Yeah.
If you're someone who's more into fantasy, the stuff that features the Jedi and the deep of this really expansive religion, then that's a bit of Star Wars that you like. If you're somebody who appreciates more grounded media and stuff like The Mandalorian and Andor and Obi to an extent, that sort of stuff fits more. But it's refreshing to have Star Wars media, modern Star Wars media, that doesn't suck, because we've had quite a lot of Star Wars media that sucked.
Suddenly, somehow, Palpatine has returned.
Anytime I feel bad about anything that I've done or I've written or I've made, I think somebody in a Lucasfilm writing studio went, somehow Palpatine returned and that got greenlit. And I feel better. It's like magic.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a great show. Julia, have you got some facts for us?
I have a few. The first one I'll talk about, which I thought was quite fun, I've mentioned how Mandalorian feels quite grounded, and I didn't realise how much the weapons that they use in The Mandalorian are based on real life weaponry. So some of the weapons that you see in the Razor Crest, some of them are real guns, a few of them are airsoft guns that they've put in to make real, but Mando's blaster pistol is apparently based on an 1894 Bergman pistol with a few different modifications. Cara Dune's big kind of blaster rifle is a mix of a British Bren gun and a German MG15 magazine. It just feels like they've really gone, what are all like the cool looking weapons that we can find in history, and then put them into the future, which I just really appreciate. The next thing that I will talk about, we've got to talk about Grogu.
Yes.
So obviously this, and again with the groundedness of this TV show, it's a lot of practical effects. So obviously Grogu's puppet, the aliens are all practical. Do you want to hazard a guess at how much the Grogu puppet cost?
More money than you and I have ever seen in one place at one time?
Yeah. Just a cool $5 million. I feel with some, especially when Cara Dune's actress picks him up. My mum was saying this. She doesn't quite pick him up like a baby. There's definitely a, I'm hoisting $5 million worth of animatronics right now. But he also takes 4 people to puppet him.
Wow.
And that just brings me a lot of joy just thinking about making his little feet go. Initially, they were going to use fox calls and calls from an animal called a kinkajou, which is like a possum, raccoony kind of thing. That please Google them; they are so cute. And then later they added the human baby noises and babble just to make him a little bit more realistic.
Yeah,
I'm here for. You might remember when the trailer released, there was a few kind of meme edits of, you know, when Grogu's like pushing the button in the Razor Crest and then Mando pushes it back on and he pushes it off again. There was one meme where somebody had put Africa by Toto playing, so Grogu's trying to turn it on. But Pedro Pascal saw this meme, and in his words he said it would be very out of character actually for the Mando to turn off Africa. He would keep it on, according to Pedro Pascal. But if it was Yoda by Weird Al Yankovic, then that is definitely staying off. So Africa, Mando approved. It is fully stamped by Dingerin himself. Speaking of Pedro Pascal, he actually doesn't appear in every episode.
Yes, this was quite a contentious issue.
Yes.
Because if I remember rightly, Bryce Dallas Howard, Ron Howard's daughter, an acclaimed actress and director in her own right, she had directing duties on this job. And she was directing, like, what was it, episode 2, episode 3 or something?
She's done a few.
Quite a few. And then somebody asked her, like, what's it like working with Pedro Pascal? And she said, I don't know, I haven't worked with him yet. It was like, okay.
Yeah, so from my research, there's kind of a few areas. Season 1, episode 4, he definitely does not appear in at all. That is already doubled. The reason being for that specifically is that he was in rehearsals for his run as Edmund in King Lear on Broadway. So I guess he's excused.
What somebody pointed out that I found interesting is that the Mandalorian armor has the same effect as Spider-Man's costume, because it gives the character complete anonymity, so everybody can see themselves as Mando in the same way that everybody can see themselves as Spider-Man, because he becomes this mirror, if you like, that you could put yourself into. Does that make sense?
Yeah. You know? I do like a sort of masked character that way. V, for example, in V for Vendetta is exceptionally well, and a good body actor can really make those characters, because Hugo Weaving does such an excellent job at conveying very small things just in body language. Yeah. Of course, I can't tell the difference whether it's Pedro Pascal or the 2 stunt doubles that were used to model his physical presence. But yeah, I don't know, something just feels a bit disappointing that it's not him the whole time.
Do you feel like it impacted the story?
No, knowing now, it's a bit like finding out that your mum hid greens in your mashed potato and you didn't notice. Like eating them, it was fine. You didn't notice and you didn't care. It didn't change the flavour profile. But knowing now, you feel a bit like,
feels a bit different. Yeah.
But speaking of Bryce Dallas Howard, she did direct some episodes of The Mandalorian, but actually Deborah Chow, who, and I hope I'm pronouncing that, I'm not sure if it's Chu or Chow, she directed season 1 episode 3 and season 1 episode 7, and actually was the first woman to direct any live action Star Wars project. In the year of our Lord, 2019?
Yeah, 2019, because the Americans got it before us. Gosh.
It's a bit crazy to me.
Yes.
But,
You have to remember, speaking in 2025, there are as many Star Wars projects as there are stars in the sky. Yeah. And like live action Star Wars, at least back in 2019, I could conceivably hold them in my head. I could picture how many.
Yeah, I've got a touch of franchise fatigue when it comes to Star Wars, because there is so much of it now.
Now where I'm like, I'll get round to it. I'm not.
And not all of it. I don't know.
This shows my absolute fan hypocrisy when it comes to Star Wars, and I have to hold my hands up and be like, I'm a terrible person, because I do have those whiny things of, do I really have to watch all of Clone Wars? Whereas if it's Star Trek, it's like, it's Star Trek Prodigy, and I know you have to really have watched all of Star Trek Voyager and understand exactly what's going on in Lower Decks over here, but that's fine. We've all been doing this over the last 30 years, so I don't know what everyone's complaining about.
I think because Clone Wars, the television show, was airing over my not quite my childhood, but my sort of my teens. So
Yeah.
a lot of people actually watched it as it aired, but it was also something where you'd watch a couple episodes of it, you know, like, because it was just airing at the time. But to sit down and watch all of the Clone Wars, it's 7 seasons and not all of it is like completely relevant, because you'll get the filler episodes and the beach episodes and this kind of stuff. But it's so crazy how the, you know, like the Ahsoka storyline spans several different pieces of media. So if you want to watch Ahsoka, you need to go back and watch the Clone Wars, and then you need to go and watch Rebels, which again, these animated shows that sort of aired, what I would call like casually aired. They're ones that sort of they would fit in with different things that were going on. But it's all, to be fair, it's also why I quite like Mandalorian and those kinds of TV shows, because they're truly episodic.
Yeah.
A lot of TV now is like reading a book where you've got chapters of the book being aired to you. So really, to understand episode 3, you have to go back and watch episode 2 and 1, because all of that is relevant. Whereas with Mandalorian, the episodes are really nicely contained as, this is the episode where, you know, we save the town from pirates. This is the episode where we take out that big crate dragon that lives in the cave. This is the episode where Jawa is stolen by ship parts and I have to go get them back.
What's really interesting about it is that it's one of the first sort of shows that was like made directly for Disney Plus.
Yeah.
And they had this moment, I feel like, where they realized, hey, we could make the episodes as long as they need to be. They could be 20 minutes long, they could be an hour long. Let's just make the episode, let's tell the story as much as we need to tell the story, and when we're finished telling the story, we will stop. And I just love that, you know?
Yeah.
There's something perversely freeing about that, I think.
Yeah, it's like you could watch an episode sort of 2 or 3 in, and as long as you saw the previously on, you were up to date. It wasn't like sometimes when you watch a previously on, it gives you the cliff notes, but really you needed to have seen the episode to fully get, you know, what's going on. But they're just so nicely episodic that you can watch in chunks. And I watched the whole of Mandalorian. I'm mid-season 3 now because I took quite a big break. But I watched Mandalorian in chunks where I take quite big breaks between each chunk, and I would still come in going, oh yeah, I remember what happens. This is the episode where they're breaking it out of prison. Yeah. Boom, I'm up to date. I'm caught up. That's all I need to do. That is all my facts now.
Amazing. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. I love those. Hey guys, it's Editing Giles here. And we've just dropped our U2 bonus episode on our Patreon page. In it, I hear from a minister and U2 superfan, Reverend Tim Edworthy, who talks us through his 40-year fandom with the greatest Christian rock band that never was. I'm also joined by the host of the RE podcast, Louisa Jane Smith, who loves the band so much she actually did her dissertation on them. Here's a clip.
In some ways, again, like a lot of people of my age who were brought up in the Christian faith, U2 became something of the soundtrack to my life, and probably helped me explore the Christian faith more deeply through the lyrics. And there's always this thing, I think, whenever U2 brings out a new album, well, whenever, I hope they will bring out a new album. It's been 7 years since the last studio album, but those who are of a sort of religious disposition will be poring over the lyrics and seeing where are the God references, where are the Jesus references, you know, however tenuous they are, you know, and very often they're not that tenuous, but you know, seeing, you know, what that's saying about, well, Bono's faith in particular, but maybe other members of the band too.
If you want to hear the full episode, you can go to www.patreon.com/God in Film podcast and sign up to our Bishop Waller Bridge tier. You can also check out our God in Gaming episode. We have longer, extended cuts of interviews and uncut episodes on there where you'll hear it first and in full. We are very lucky to have a dyed-in-the-wool, first-generation Star Wars fan for this next one who is ready to turn an academic eye on The Mandalorian. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, my name's James Rose. I'm a film academic who specialises in horror films and science fiction. I've written a few books. My first was Beyond Hammer, British horror cinema since 1970. And since then, I've written a number of other monographs, one particularly about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I've appeared in various edited collections about horror films, a little bit about comics, and in a number of academic journals as well.
James, thank you so much for being on the podcast there. If you love sci-fi and horror, when you first saw the opening trailers for The Mandalorian with those like stormtrooper helmets on spikes, that must have made your day, surely.
It was a very powerful image, particularly given that I'm of the original trilogy generation. I was the right age when it first came out in the cinemas. I bought into it massively, and my life became sort of Star Wars for a number of years. I remember sitting in the back of the family car, and I just bought the official, I think it's called the official souvenir book for The Empire Strikes Back, not quite realising it had the whole story in. So I watched The Empire Strikes Back and saw all of those fantastic dark turns that it takes in the back of a car in a car park in the middle of a mundane West Midlands town. And I was gutted, but also really excited. And I wanted to tell my dad, and he was absolutely adamant that I shouldn't say a word about it, and he just hid the book. So now that I'm much older and starting to see Star Wars being revitalised by Disney, it's really interesting, and particularly that image, because it speaks volumes about what's happened after the original trilogy. So seeing those stormtroopers' heads literally on spikes, they're not heads, are they? They're helmets, but they may as well be heads. So it's quite a medieval image. It's quite powerful. But yeah, I was very excited when I saw it.
As you say, there's a lot more Star Wars than there used to be. So that leads me into my first proper question. Who or what is the Mandalorian, and where does he fit in the Star Wars chronology?
The events of the Mandalorian take place, I think it's 4 or 5 years after the Return of the Jedi, but before Rey's trilogy, so before The Force Awakens. So he sort of bridges, or his experiences and the experiences we see bridge the two sort of trilogies, really. So I guess that also means things like Ahsoka are part of that sort of timeline, and also the Book of Boba Fett fits in there as well. So, and he moves in and out of all of those narratives. So he's the consistent narrative, really. But in terms of who he is, perhaps it's tricky, but then perhaps it's not, because when we first meet him, all we really know of him is that he's a member of the Bounty Hunters Guild, and that as a bounty hunter, he's extremely proficient, and because of that, he's extremely feared, and he's the one that everybody wants to get the bounty. And because of that, he becomes like a Clint Eastwood Man with No Name character, and that's of course amplified by the imagery that we see of him, and also the soundtrack very much leans into that trilogy of films soundtrack. So we don't know much about him. He is literally a bounty hunter with no name, but then little parts of him are revealed to us as the first season progresses, and we find out at the end that his name is Din Djarin, and that his parents were killed during the Clone Wars. He was found by a group of Mandalorian warriors who, realising he's an orphan, take him on board as a foundling and raise him as if he was a Mandalorian. By the time he reaches his sort of maturity, and this is, I guess, the interesting bit, he joins the Children of the Watch, which is quite a religious sect of the Mandalorian culture, and they have quite a strict doctrine, and he adheres to it extremely closely. And one of those things is that he can't take his helmet off in the company of others. So we've spent all these episodes not seeing his face, and we finally find out why we can't see his face. And then, of course, in the events of that final episode, it means he has to take his mask off. And we see Pedro Pascal for the first time.
He's basically Clint Eastwood in space, effectively. That makes me think, like, what do you think of the representation of masculinity in The Mandalorian? What do you think makes it interesting? Because we have a very archetypal starting point, but it's not where we end, is it?
He's really, really, really interesting in terms of contemporary masculinity and what we perceive masculinity to be at this point in time. So when we first meet him, as I've said, he's a ruthless killer. And really, he's just a very stereotypical Yvonne Tasker-esque hard body. And that's compounded not just by his violence, but by his Beskar armour. He's got this incredibly muscular, incredibly powerful costume, ultimately, that he wears. and that costume protects him from other violence. And really, the whole sort of 3 seasons that we've seen so far, and the other appearances that he makes, it's about him coming out of that armour, really. It's about him revealing himself. So that masculinity starts off as being very stereotypical, a proper lone wolf, someone who doesn't want a relationship, doesn't want to interact with others, and doesn't want to really talk to others. But as his encounters with the child, or the asset as it's first called, and then Grogu, we start to see him come out. And the pivotal point is, of course, when the Mandalorian, as we know him at that point, shoots the other bounty hunter droid in the head. And we think he's taking the asset for himself. But when he sees the asset and sees it's a child, he begins to emerge. So there's perhaps quite a symbolic moment. He opens up the case that the asset's in, and we see the child for the first time. And that mirrors the beginning of the Mandalorian, or Mando, or Darjin, opening up himself. So as the journey goes on, he becomes more and more human. He becomes a different version of masculinity. And I think, for me, as a father, the most powerful thing about it is that he is a single parent, he's a single father. And I think sometimes that gets lost a little bit in interpretations of him. I think it's really important to stress that, because he's a man alone who's adopted a child, which he does by the end of season 3. And he's sworn to protect him. And that changes his masculinity completely.
Yeah.
I think it's a really complex masculinity, but also one that's extremely refreshing for today.
And I think you've answered my last question already, like what makes the Din Djarin and Grogu relationship so special. It's that being able to shift context from being this sort of like stereotypical bounty hunter to being this quite loving dad, effectively. And it's lovely to see a functional relationship in the Star Wars universe, because fathers and sons have not always had a great time of it.
I think that's also something that's quite important to acknowledge, is that he's one of the very few good fathers in Star Wars. Obviously, the most obvious one is Darth Vader. Darth Vader cuts his own son's hand off as like a castrating punishment for all of the things that he's done. And then as a weird welcome into the dark side, I'll slice your hand off, and then we can be equals. We can be both robotic. We can be both cyborg, and we can both be the dark side together.
Because from Anakin's perspective, just losing a hand is nothing. It's like if you've just been nearly attacked by volcanic lava everywhere and there's barely anything of you left. A hand, he's like, what? It's a flesh wound.
Yeah, it is literally. It's just a warning shot, isn't it, really? Yeah. A glancing blow from Darth Vader. But he's a bad dad, whereas Mando isn't weighed down by his past. He's able to say, that's happened. I now need to focus on my adopted son and make him better. Amazing. And I think that's reflected in his willingness to give him over to Luke, so that they have to be away from each other, but they're away from each other for the greater good of them both. Yeah. That's what makes, like I said, it's such a beautiful relationship to see in contemporary media.
James, I could talk to you about this all day, and by the sounds of it, you could happily talk about it as well. Thank you so much for your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, Julia, that was James Rose. What did you think?
I'm always super jealous of people that were able to have like a Star Wars trilogy to grow up with, because I was in between. I remember seeing when they re-released Phantom Menace, I think for like maybe like a 10-year anniversary or something like that. But like I didn't get to grow up with them. Yeah. I would love to have gone to see Empire Strikes Back, or, you know, read the souvenir guide, not knowing the twist that Darth Vader is Luke's dad. If I could do anything, I would love someone to just wipe my memory of that knowledge and then watch the original trilogy. Yeah. Because I'm one of those where it's such common knowledge now, even if you've not seen Star Wars, you know that he's his dad. Like, what would it be like to not know that and watch the original trilogy? Yeah, both you and George Lucas will never be able to watch that film in the way that other people did, you know? Yeah. I didn't especially grow up with the prequel trilogy because I was 16 when Phantom came out in 99. And I remember going to watch it and I'm like, huh. And then Attack of the Clones came out, and then obviously Revenge of the Sith back in like 2005-ish. So for me,
that prequel series was a series of films all about falling in love with Natalie Portman, which I can definitely get on board with, you know?
Yeah, understandable.
Now it's time for Finding the Faith in the Film.
Ba-ba!
So, I think one of the things that stuck with me about what James said was that Din Djarin is one of the few good dads in the Star Wars universe. You know,
there's not many.
I mean, it's a you know, the competition is poor, but still, the idea of like him being like an adopted dad to Grogu, and you could tell the love between them is real.
Yeah,
and it's, how can I put it? It's not complicated. It's not showy, but it's so genuine.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can't have about it. And one of the things that people don't really talk about that much is being a Christian is all about being adopted. Okay? So you have in the Old Testament that the people of Israel are God's chosen people, and they can, you know, they can mark their lineage back to David, who can then mark it back to Abraham, and so on and so forth. And you have all the nonsense that comes with it. And the best thing about being a Christian is just you decided that you wanted to be part of God's family, and God was like, yeah, okay, sounds good, you know? And that's one of the things I love about it, is there's an intentionality behind it, you know?
Yeah, it's not got this big bloodline emphasis, which Star Wars tends to have. You know, the Skywalker bloodline, which bloodline is Rey going to be from? Because she must be, because, you know, she's as powerful. But it's like Din Djarin found a random baby and was like, this is my baby now. And the baby was like, you're my dad now.
Yeah, you know?
And they love each other. And they're so cute.
I'll give you just this little quote from John, the beginning of Gospel of John. Now, do you know, have we talked about like the difference between the Gospels at all?
If we have, I'm a bad student. I may have slept since then and forgotten about it.
Okay.
Like,
so picture it like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called the Synoptic Gospels because they overlap with each other. Mark is one of the first ones out. It's a little bit like, all right, shut up. This is how it went down. Boom. You know? Luke is trying to appeal to the Greeks. Matthew is trying to appeal to the Jews a little bit more. And John is just pure, unadulterated poetry. And it's beautiful. I'll let you listen. This is the Apostle John is right now. He's talking about John the Baptist. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. And the true light that gives light to everyone was coming to the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or of husband's will, but born of God. I've got flipping goosebumps just reading that, you know? It's so beautiful. I don't have anything particularly more fascinating to say beyond, because like my boys, I love my boys, I adore them, but I got what I got and I'm working with what I've got. You know what I mean? The sense of being chosen by God. And we have in the past talked about free will and predestination and all that jazz. I keep it real simple. I'm like, let's just choose to be chosen and go from there, you know?
Yeah, no, totally.
And I said I was going to make light work of that because there's one thing I want to talk about, and it took up a lot of my brain time. I started thinking I was going to go in one way, and I went in another way, actually quite different to it, you know? And it's Din Djarin removing his helmet, which is the big deal. How would you say that is framed at the beginning of the series?
It's been a little while since I've watched season 1. I did rewatch the episode in season 2 where they have the heist to get the coordinates for Moff Gideon's, and of course he has to take his helmet off then. It's slightly less impactful because obviously we've seen it before, but for me I think that one kind of hits a bit harder because when he takes his helmet off for Grogu, I mean, it's for Grogu.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? That's his son, that's his child whom he loves. But when he has to take his helmet off in the mess hall with these random Imperial officers to get the job done, because I suppose in a way it is for Grogu as well, because, you know, he needs to get back to Grogu. But that one is like, I don't know, like he has to really, really break his creed in such a way just to get the job done. And that's such a great episode for Mayfield, is that his name? The convict's redemption arc as well.
The one by Bill,
you know
played by Bill Burr.
Yeah, you're wearing that helmet. It's not your helmet, so is it really the same? I never saw your face.
Your face. Do what you need to do. I never saw your face. That was actually the thing that I started with, of like, how do you support somebody in a fundamentalist religion who is having that bit of cognitive dissonance for the first time, you know?
Yeah.
So by removing his helmet, Din is essentially betraying the most fundamental tenet of his religion, the Children of the Watch. And in doing so, he's rejected by his sect. And I think it wouldn't be too much of a jump. I reckon you could probably imagine some things in Christianity that some people would see as that kind of breaking point, that if you do this, you are nothing. And weirdly, it's never normally about Jesus. You know, if somebody says, I don't believe in Jesus, you're like, yeah, okay. But it could be something like biblical inerrancy, or becoming LGBTQ affirming, turning against young earth creationism, all this kind of stuff that I grew up in this quite fundamentalist sort of church. As I grew up, I became a Christian there like 97. We left in 2000. So it wasn't like it had the most massive impact on my life chronologically, but it was a massive turning point in my life.
Yeah, a lot can happen in 3 years. Like, my uni course was 3 years. A lot happened that really shaped me as a person. So,
and the Mayfield character, the way he supports Din at that moment, I never saw your face. I loved that, and it made me think about, like, how do you support somebody leaving a fundamentalist religion? Because we talked about this to an extent on the It Ends With Us episode, and I think there's probably a lot of crossover between how do you support somebody leaving a fundamentalist religion versus how do you support somebody leaving an abusive relationship, because it's still abuse. There's just the scale and supporting characters when it comes to a fundamentalist is bigger, you know. And I found this wonderful blog, I think possibly by a guy called Brian McLaren, and it was called How to Talk to Fundamentalist Evangelicals. And I could have talked about Mormons, who I feel like we've already given a kicking.
Yeah, we ragged on them pretty hard under the bus.
We rolled on them real hard, you know. And I feel like this is one of those things you've got to sort out your own yard first before you can go to anybody else's religion and say, no, you're doing it wrong. So I picked Evangelicals because them's my peeps, you know. So I'm going to read out some of the things he said on this website. I will put a link to it in the episode. He says, you can wait for someone to say something you find false, unhelpful, or offensive. Then, rather than arguing back, just say, wow, I see that differently. They'll likely ask why, and rather than arguing, especially in public, which almost guarantees a defensive reaction, I'd recommend you say, with pleasantness and kindness, I'd rather not go into it now. For now, I just wanted you to know that I see it differently. If you're curious, sometime in the future, I'll be glad to share why in private. There's a great power in a non-directive, non-aggressive statement. I see that differently. And a great gift in differing without needing to convince. And Soren Kierkegaard, who I've never heard of, said that the apostle, the person who carries the message of good news, must be like a midwife. Midwives know that no mother wants to give birth in public. Similarly, people prefer generally to give birth to a new opinion in private. So we offer what we can in public, but then withdraw so that people can process and go through the labour on their own. And I thought that was lovely.
Yeah, no, that is really cool.
Because I have a tendency sometimes to be a little bit confrontational with this stuff. Even when I'm smiling and trying to sound nice and polite, I still can get people's backs up. And again, it's what I've always been trying to work on is how win the person, not the argument. Because even if you do win the argument, and you lose the person, it doesn't really matter then. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm the same with Star Wars opinions. Someone
Yeah.
might look at me and go, "Oh no, I thought Finn had a really great character arc," and I'll go, "But I think what I need to do now is go, oh, okay, I see that differently."
Yeah, I see that differently.
We can talk about that another time. Yeah,
I see that differently.
That's so interesting.
Let's grab a coffee sometime and have a chat about it, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's one thing I'm going to work on putting into practice, that phrase, I see that differently, without having to sort of like go down rabbit hole, because that's something I'm really, really want to work on. So again, I first thought of this removal of the helmet was a sign that Din Djarin was leaving his fundamentalist religion. But Din Djarin doesn't give up on the creed of the Children Watch. He doesn't remove his helmet because he thinks it's the right thing to do and that his sect have got it wrong. In fact, he's quite open about it. He's quite respectful. He says, I had to, I remove my helmet and the rest of it. And I found this really lovely article from Molly Brazel on Screen Rant. Again, I'll put a link up in here, and I'll give you the quote. So, Din breaking his creed twice over Grogu was never meant to show any type of disdain for his way of life or his religion. Rather, it was meant to prove something significant about their relationship. The creed meant everything to Din, as it had been protecting him ever since he was a child from a harsh galaxy that had hurt him at such a young age. Din breaking his creed for Grogu proved that his son meant even more to him than the one other thing he held dearest. Not that the creed had become meaningless to him. And that's really nice, because in essence, the reason why so many people struggle with leaving their religions or leaving fundamentalist groups or things like that is it's your entire community. And it's really hard to turn your back on the people that love you. And I think we've talked about that in the past. And I think it's just this moment of choosing your child over your religion. And there's something I'm going to say now, and it's not the sort of thing that I would have said as a younger me. But if my religion makes me choose between my son and my religion, I'll choose my sons every time. I'll choose my children every time. And that's not something that was encouraged, if you like, because it was all about making those hard sacrifices and those hard choices and the rest of it. And I don't think that's necessarily what's needed here, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm going to throw one thing out to you now. Do you know anything about Abraham and Isaac?
So I might know a little bit about this.
Okay.
It's Abraham's the dad.
Abraham is the dad?
And then Isaac's the kid, right?
That's correct, yeah.
Yes. God asks him to sacrifice Isaac, doesn't he? And then he's going to, and then an angel intervenes and is like, oh, haha, JK, but it's cute to know that you do that for me.
This is one of those funny things where when you hear the story for the first time, either in Sunday school or Bible study or whatever, you'll hear about Abraham's tremendous faith in God and how he wouldn't even spare his son if God asked him to. And usually the next thing is, now, God's probably not going to ask us to sacrifice our children, but can we have the same level of faith and obedience to God as possible? Now, you are going to watch me process this in real time, okay? I have not necessarily come to all my conclusions on this, but there's something about this that doesn't quite flow. And again, the temptation for me sometimes can be to say, okay, this part of the Bible, is it a metaphor? Is it an allegory? Is it something else? I'm not going to do that right now. I'm not going to say, I think they misunderstood. I'm going to read it and we're going to see if we can find any clues in there. Okay? So this is Genesis 22, which I think we think was written sometime around 1470 BC.
This is Old Testament stuff.
Yeah. Hella Old Testament, so 1400 years before Jesus even arrives, this is being written down, and it's probably based on an oral tradition that goes back and back and back and back and back and back, okay? Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, he replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain. I will show you." We hear no reaction. We just hear verse 3. "Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, 'Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you.' Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac." So Isaac is carrying it at this point. "And he himself carried the fire," which I still don't fully understand if anybody knows what it means by carried the fire.
He's got a torch.
Possibly?
Like he's carrying a torch with him?
Yeah,
it's how I would.
Yeah, let's go with that.
That's how I would interpret that.
Cool. Yeah, carry the fire in there. As the 2 of them went up together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the ram for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand, took the knife to slay his son, but the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram, sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called that place "The Lord will provide," and to this day it is said, "On the mountain the Lord will provide." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of the enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." Okay, so there's a lot in there, right? I'm going to ask a few questions for you to think about.
Yeah, okay.
So Abraham and Sarah are really, really old when Isaac is born. Isaac is the son that Abraham always wanted. We're going to put aside biological realities for a moment, because in Genesis it says that Abraham was 100 years old when his son was born, and Sarah was 90 years old when Isaac was born. We are going to hand wave that for a moment and be like, okay, fine. But crucially, he was promised to them by God, and they had to wait. They had to wait about 25 years between God promising them and Isaac turning up, you know? So imagine for a moment that you're Abraham, and there's been this whole thing about how God loves you and you love God and you guys are so great, and he's promised you this son, and you wake up one day and then God says, "I want you to take your son and sacrifice him." Now, this is probably one of those things that relies a little bit on facial expressions, which is not great for an audio medium. But if God, who promised me a son, who gave me a son in the most miraculous of circumstances, then says one day, "I want you to sacrifice him," and assuming your understanding of God is that he's not just punitive, childish, and a bully just for the sake of it. I imagine if I had to imagine the conversation, it would have been like, because we never get Abraham's reaction. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the region where you sacrifice him there as burnt offering on the mountain. I will show you. The way I imagine Abraham responding to that was like, okay.
I get that obviously he's testing his faith, but it's a bit like,
which leads me to my next question.
Yeah.
Right? God, omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnipowerful. for want of a better phrase. God knows everything, okay? Literally, he knows everything. He knows the amount of hairs on your head. He knows what's going on in your heart. He knows how many planets are orbiting Alpha Centauri at this moment. So why does God need to test your faith? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, honestly, I hadn't even considered that as an option because, yeah, from what I understand, a lot of the Old Testament stuff, some of it is like a manual for living. You know, don't have dead bodies near the house because it's going to contaminate your stuff. Don't eat shellfish, I assume, because if you're in a hot country, maybe they're not going to keep for as long. Things that don't make much sense to us now because our culture is entirely different, but would make sense then.
Yeah.
So sometimes I look at these and go, is there a reason why this would be a thing?
This is where I'm getting up to now.
And I see no reason for this to be a thing other than, like, prove how much you love me. Like, I feel for normal people that's like, oh, yeah, I will get you a random chocolate bar from the shop when you didn't ask.
Yeah. This is the point I'm getting at, because my God is not a prove how much you love me kind of God. You know, he's not a jump through hoops for my entertainment kind of God. So my theory is that Abraham never really thinks that God actually will make him sacrifice his son. Because check this out. Verse 4, on the third day Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And verse 5, he said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Okay, so he's saying myself and my son, who I'm meant to be sacrificing, are going to come back to you. So I don't think he ever really thinks that this is going to play out in a bad way.
Or he just didn't want to, like, straight up tell his servants, yeah, yo, don't say bye to Isaac because you ain't going to see him.
Now that's,
I feel if my employer went, stay here, I'm going up to a remote mountain with my son and a bunch of firewood. If I come back alone, don't ask questions.
Yeah.
I'm probably going to try and intervene, you know?
And in a world where human rights exists, then you would, you know, but that's not the world that they're living in right now. And then there's some other weird stuff where he says, because we get this repetition coming back, now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. And again, I don't have the verse handy, but a little bit earlier, I said that they'd been promised a son, right? They had to wait 25 years for the son to arrive. And they kind of lost faith in God at that point. There's one point where Sarah says, take my maidservant Hagar, have a child with her, and that child will be our child. And Abraham does that. There are some times when you shouldn't do what your wife tells you, you know. If it's sleep with my maidservant or kill the King of Scotland, those are times when you tell your missus, darling, I think we're out of line here. And Ishmael, who is the son that comes from that sort of union, he's obviously legitimate, but he's not completely disowned. Actually, God looks after Hagar and God looks after Ishmael, and Ishmael is seen to be like the founder of the Arab people, if you like. So he's always had some significance. So this whole your son, your only son nonsense doesn't quite track either. And if there are any Old Testament scholars listening out there, I would love to know what is going on with that line, because that doesn't make any sense. So have you ever had this thing in school where you're having a conversation with a teacher or another professional and you're saying something and that other person might be talking to you, but really they're actually talking to the class that's in front of them and you're doing it indirectly?
Yeah.
You know, where you say,
I think I know what you mean. Yeah.
Now, Miss Hall, please remember that we absolutely can't go this time because X will happen and such and such.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
I feel like with this story, there's something else going on here. This feels like Abraham is letting himself be used for a story, and that story might have some significance to a wider audience rather than to himself. Abraham doesn't need his faith tested because God already knows how Abraham feels about him. This is one of the things I was thinking. So there's this guy, Rav Kook, who is Victorian, first chief rabbi of Israel, said that the climax of the story, commanding Abraham not to sacrifice Isaac, is the whole point. To put an end to God's total aversion to the ritual of child sacrifice. And according to Irving Greenberg, the story of the binding of Isaac symbolizes the prohibition to worship God by human sacrifices, a time when human sacrifices were the norm worldwide. So this whole story about God to sacrifice, telling him his child, is really a story about how actually God doesn't want that at all.
It's giving, so I forget which, like, I think it was like a Prussian king or something in like the 17th century. And he was trying to make potatoes a thing with the peasantry.
Yeah.
Because potatoes were new, but also, like, you know, potatoes are great, right?
Yeah.
But people didn't want the potatoes at all. So what he did is he had a royal, like, potato field that was royal, and you definitely shouldn't steal from the royal potato field. And of course, then because it was something that you shouldn't do, the peasants stole potatoes, and then bam, you know, they had potatoes. So it's like, you shouldn't do this thing. It's giving Prussian potatoes.
It was almost like God is saying, look, I want it on record that this is not something I do. And he has to stop this whole situation.
Goes back to, like, you know, don't eat shellfish on, like, sunny days because you'll probably get sick.
Yeah.
Don't kill kids because it's just not cool.
That's not what we do, how we roll, you know? Because obviously later on in the Old Testament, we get the prophets of Baal it's all about sacrificing children and stuff like that. So in a way, like, the sort of the country of Israel, by not sacrificing children, makes them unusual. It's like their USP. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even 1400 years later in the Roman world, a baby doesn't have any human rights until it's been alive for about, a year, something like that. So this idea that a child is precious and isn't just property, we take it for granted, but it's totally...
Yeah, like, something I either heard or read, but the idea that the concept of a childhood is actually a very modern thing. So even if you go back maybe 100, 200 years, when your kid is old enough to pull the cotton out from underneath the machinery or feed the chickens, that's what they're doing. It doesn't matter that they're, like, I don't know, 6. They're small enough to go up that chimney, they're going. Whereas now it's like, this child is 6, they are still a child, and they deserve to be sheltered and looked after until they are mature enough. But the concept of a childhood and nurturing children the way that we think of it now wasn't a thing.
Yeah.
Even as early as, like, 200 years ago. So especially if you're going all the way back to 1400 years before Christ, you know, as soon as this kid is old enough to be useful, it's, you know, that's what they're going to do. And I imagine the mortality rate as well is going to be a factor in that, because if your baby doesn't live the full year and that's a normal thing, then, you know, it's not. I've explained that horribly, but my brain understood what I was trying to say. This
is my emerging Gilesian headcanon, okay? And it's not to say what I've said before about, like, I don't think this happened, or I think this is poetry or anything. Something like this happened. But again, this is written in 1470-ish. And the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, are historically meant to have been written by Moses. So Moses is out there, he's in the wilderness. There's a whole thing about going up to Mount Sinai, getting the tablets, while he's up there up on the mountain for like a year. People are worshipping this golden calf.
Yeah.
So a story about why ritual sacrifice of children is bad would actually probably come in quite useful when you're trying to deal with a group of people living out in the wilderness, in the desert, who are quite desperate and who are willing to try just about anything. Yeah. And this story is saying, hey, don't do that thing. No. Again, if you think of human history as an epic grand narrative written by the creator of the universe, this has a boatload of foreshadowing. Because essentially God is saying that he won't make you give up your child for him, but he would give up his child for you. And that's a lovely parallel, I think. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was Bo-Katan. How would you describe Bo-Katan?
Bo-Katan, so she's still Mandalorian. She's not the same sect that Din Djarin is, but really she's a lost leader. So she obviously used to be leader of Mandalore, and then Mandalore got blown up.
Yeah. And I think
pretty bad.
I think that's made her quite pragmatic, hasn't it?
Yes.
And when we see her take the helmet off for the first time, that's when we first find out that there are different ways. There's more than one way of being a true Mandalorian, for want of a better phrase, you know? So Bo-Katan is initially presented as being more reasonable and more rational than Din Djarin. But Bo-Katan has her own things that she can't quite get past. She can't take the Darksaber from Din because she believes she has to take it from Moff Tarkin in battle. And there's a wonderful kind of inversion then of her fundamentalist views versus Din being like, just take it, just have it. I don't care. And she feels like she can't. You can almost see her being the awkwardness of it, you know?
Yeah, I think she also knows if she wants to take it her way, then she has to kill Din. And she doesn't want to do that, you know, when there's a friendship between them. And then obviously that makes her quite bitter. It means that her sect leave her because in their eyes she's not a true leader. And she is then left alone in this vast, empty palace with a bit of a chip on her shoulder, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think for me, how I read Bo-Katan as being the more, you're going to hate this, progressive Mandalorian, if you like, you know? And what it showed me is that progressives have their own red lines and their own unexamined beliefs. And normally, often, I'm putting myself in the more left-wing, more progressive side of things and looking at the more conservative, more right-wing sides of Christianity and be like, are we sure that's okay, dudes? I'm just going to like hop the other way now and just say that a lot of time there's progressives can have their own red lines and unexamined beliefs, because in our discourse we can often descend into this kind of tribalism. So we tend to agree with people who we perceive as being in our tribe, and we want to negate the beliefs of others in a tribe that we perceive as being not in our tribe. Do you know what I mean? So it's a lot harder than it used to be because we're constantly drawn into polemics. And I'm not going to give any examples of what those unexamined beliefs are, because I think it's worth asking yourselves, when you think about an opinion or an issue that you're on one side of, and you're thinking about the thing the other person is saying, does this person who I normally disagree with have a point? And I think that's worth asking. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
you know?
It's worth examining because, you know, it's something that I need to work on. I, you know, can be very polarizing between what I think is correct and what I think is not correct. Usually in certain political matters, which I will not go into here. And I think it's much easier for that to happen in things like social media, where you are following people who agree with you.
100%.
That's with any kind of extreme, you know, left or right. You get into these very
echo chambers.
And then when you have to speak to someone who is not in that thing, you find that there's often a disparity. But I think Mandalorian culture itself tends to fall into these different sects. From what I dimly know of the deep lore, you know, it's one that's always been very regulated by codes of honor and rules. I think it just depends on which particular set of rules you fall into. I think it's something that Bo mentions when they're on. She says, you know, our people were killing each other for reasons too confusing to explain.
Mm-hmm.
By which point the Empire could, you know, run in and just completely purge the place. It's a culture that, at least how it's been painted, tends to fall into these kinds of echo chambers naturally.
Yeah. In essence, everybody should be asking themselves why they believe what they believe.
Touch some grass every so often, you know, step outside your comfort zone, and then pop back again, you know, just poke your head out the door, read the news, go, okay, actually, go back inside, regret that you've read the news, but be proud of yourself for doing it anyway.
Awesome. That wraps up our Finding the Faith in the Film section. I'm going to give a very quick shout out to our lovely patrons and say thank you. So that's James Pittard, Salma Saleh, Sarah Cooper, Philip J. Coleman, Lance Kane, and Natalie Faye Miniker. Thank you guys. Thank you for your support. We love you very much.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have been, thank you so much for listening. Could I urge you to leave us a review, because I am desperate for the validation, and it'd just be nice to hear what you think of the stuff that we're doing. Julia, have you had a good time?
I've had a great time. I always have such a good time on these things, and I got to talk about Grogu, so
Me too.
I'm happy.
Join us next week, ladies and gents, for our 5-year birthday episode on Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Bye!
Bye! God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff.
That's me.
Mixing and editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by
Julie Walsh.
And our theme tune was composed by
Rick Lee.
Waffle editing by
Natalie Miniker.
Please rate and review.
Please give us 5 stars because that's a nice thing to do.